there are some facets of the war in Israel that are actually tied to the war in Ukraine, and most people don't have any idea. Were you aware that Russia has 18 forward operating bases inside Syria just across the border from Israel? These are outposts that they use to keep an eye on Israel and to make it more difficult for Israel to strike at the militia groups who are firing rockets and missiles and drones out of Syria into Israel. This is, again, something that is not getting a lot of media attention, but one of the reasons that Russia has troops and more troops along the border between Israel and Syria is because they are trying to assist the Iranians in bringing weapons into Hezbollah. Iran trying to get these weapons, into Lebanon, across Syria. They want that, sort of Iranian land bridge across Syria. And whenever Israel finds that Iran is moving weapons across there, whenever they can nail down, okay, this is a place where those weapons are being driven across, Israel tries to strike at those places. But here's something you probably didn't know. Israel actually has to coordinate with Russia in order to be able to strike those places. Now, think about that for a minute. Israel has to call Russia on the phone and say, hey, we're about to strike inside Syria. And they have to coordinate with Russia because Russia's got a bunch of fighter jets in that area, and they have to deconflict. The United States has to deconflict whenever we're flying any kind of missions inside Syria as well. So this is really weird. It's one of those kind of strange things about war is that here Russia is one of our adversaries, and whenever we want to do something, we have to call our adversary and say, hey, just to let you know, we're about to do something over there. And so we don't want, because the reason we do that is we don't want to spark some sort of wider conflict by accidentally shooting down a Russian fighter jet. Does that make sense? And neither does Israel. Israel doesn't want to get into a conflict with a Russian fighter jet. That would be bad for obvious reasons. Okay, is this better? Okay. Yeah. Okay, so whenever Israel wants to strike at Syria, they have to coordinate with Russia. Now, they don't have to get Russia's permission per se, but they have to coordinate with Russia so that they don't accidentally shoot down a Russian fighter jet and vice versa. But what that does is it gives Russia the ability to alert Iran and say, hey, you might want to move your stuff out of that warehouse because it's about to get hit. Now, I don't think the IDF actually has to tell Russia the exact coordinates that it's going to strike, just that they're going to perform a strike in a general area. But even still, it's giving away their intentions. It's reducing the effectiveness of their strikes, and it's a problem. It's a big problem. Most people didn't know that Russia has troops along the border with Syria, and they didn't before the war started. They had plenty of troops in Syria. I've seen them personally when I was in Syria, but They started moving troops down to the Golan Heights on the Syrian side. There's been a UN peacekeeping force on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights since the Yom Kippur War. And are they maintaining a ceasefire? No. Are they supervising the disengagement of Israeli and Syrian forces? No. Are they monitoring the separation and limitation in the Golan Heights? Maybe. Are they reporting on breaches of that agreement? There have been dozens of breaches of that agreement from the Syrian side as Syrian militias, Iranian-backed militias in Syria, have fired across that border into the Golan Heights in Israel. So is this UNDAF force doing any good at all? Well, what do you think? Of course not. Just like the UN force that's supposed to be keeping the Hezbollah forces in Lebanon from moving south of the Litani River and from striking at Israel. That's a different UN force called UNIFIL, the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon, interim force that's been there since 1978. It's just an interim force. It's just there for a little while, just to, until things calm down. They've been there since 1978. Is that insane or what? But these forces are worse than worthless because the terrorists actually use them as human shields. The UNIFIL force in Lebanon cannot move anywhere without getting permission from Hezbollah to do so. And I would imagine that now the UNDAF force in Syria is probably in the same situation, that there are certain places they're not allowed to go. There are certain things they're not allowed to look at. So it's virtually impossible for them to do their job. But yet we, being the United States, we're funding 28% of the UN's entire budget and have been for years. Some of that money goes to fund these boondoggles of UN peacekeeping forces that are supposed to be helping to protect Israel. And they actually see their job. They don't see their job as protecting Israel so much as protecting Syria from Israel, protecting Lebanon from Israel, as if that even needed to be done. Look, Israel is no threat to its neighbors as long as its neighbors aren't attacking it. To make this war last longer. Now, and then we'll talk about why that could possibly be the case. Why is Russia actually supporting Hamas in this war and not Israel? I mean, Israel, for its part, has been very careful not to anger Russia over the war in Ukraine. So Israel has not joined the international sanctions that were imposed on Russia over the invasion of Ukraine. They should have, but they didn't. Israel has refused Ukraine's request to supply it with defensive weapons to fight against Russia. Israel is trying not to anger Russia as Russia allows, partially because Russia allows Israeli forces to operate in Syrian airspace, because again, they have to coordinate with Russia in order to do that. So even though 76% of Israelis support Ukraine in this war, feel like the Israeli government should take a stronger stance against Russia concerning the war in Ukraine, the Israeli government has avoided doing so for several reasons. First of all, Israel has, you might know this, a large Russian-speaking population, has over 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and so that kind of complicates things, as you can imagine. But most of the people, most of the Israelis including Russian Israelis, don't support what Russia is doing in Ukraine and would like for the Israeli government to take a stronger position against it. So what has Russia done since the war started in Israel, between Israel and Hamas? Well, Vladimir Putin hosted Hamas leaders in Moscow, has been strengthening ties with Palestinian militant groups, including the PIJ and Hezbollah. Obviously, these are terrorist organizations. And that's a pretty major provocation against Israel. Russia has criticized Israel's military responses in Gaza, calling them disproportionate and inhumane. Really? Disproportionate? So what would have been proportionate? What would have been the right response there? Should Israel have just flooded into Gaza and killed 1,200 civilians, burned some babies, raped some women, and then called it a day? I've argued this before. The whole concept of saying that a war needs to be disproportionate either displays a profound lack of understanding about the nature of war or the purpose of war, because the purpose of war is not to be tit for tat. That's a recipe for a war that will last forever. Tit for tat, proportionate response, guarantees that the war will never end. That's what we've seen on the northern border between Israel and Lebanon, is that Hezbollah fires a rocket or two or some missiles at Israel. Israel fires some back at Hezbollah. They play ping pong with missiles, and then nobody is getting anywhere. It's not changing anything in the equation. The only way to change the equation, the only way to put a stop to the threat, is to act so disproportionately that the enemy begs you to stop and throws up its hands and surrenders. That's the only way to win a war. So for Russia to call Israel's response in Gaza disproportionate and inhumane just shows that Russia is supporting Hamas in this war. Russia has even gone so far as to draw parallels between the blockade of Gaza. And again, let's talk about what this blockade is. The blockade in Gaza is not keeping everything out of Gaza. What Israel has been doing is they've been controlling the flow of goods into Gaza for years, because Hamas likes to bring in weapons and missiles and explosives. And so Israel hasn't been stopping the flow of food into Gaza. By their own admission. Look at what UNRWA says, that there used to be 500 trucks a day moving into Gaza. That doesn't sound like a blockade to me. Now, Israel has been inspecting those trucks to make sure that they don't contain missiles. And you would expect them to do that, since Hamas makes a habit, and has made a habit for decades, of shooting missiles at Israel. So for Russia to say Israel's blockade of Gaza is the same as Nazi Germany's siege of Leningrad during World War II is profane, to say the least. To say nothing of the hypocrisy of Russia saying that at the very same time they are assaulting the sovereignty of Ukraine. They are bombing civilians in Ukraine on a daily basis. They are absolutely wiping villages and towns off the face of the earth inside Ukraine without justification. That's pretty hypocritical. It's nuclear level hypocrisy.